Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe from multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines and many other sectors.
Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching our special edition of Easynomics. On the show today, we pick up some of the key themes that are expected in the interim budget that is to be presented by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman on the 1st of February. The 10th year of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government, the last year of his second term, and we are now heading into a general election, and that's why this is an interim budget, will be followed by a full budget by the new government sometime in July this year. So how has Modinomics performed over the past 10 years? We pick up some key themes. On the show today, we pick up the first theme of fiscal discipline and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's economic strategy in this regard. And joining me on the show today, Subhash Garg, former Finance and Economic Affairs Secretary, R. Gopalan, former Secretary of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance, and Karan Bhasin, economist based out of Washington, D.C. with international experience, including of how foreign investors look at India. But I'll begin the show by going to Mr. Garg first. Sir, social spending has gone up. If we were to take a look at the past 10 years, the numbers have gone up as far as the expenditure of the central government on various subsidies are concerned, rising from 2,54,632 crore in FY14 to as much as over 4 lakh crore in the previous financial year. But the larger question that I want to ask you is, how has Prime Minister Modi performed as far as fiscal discipline is concerned in the decade that he has been in power so far?
So, Siddharth, the Modi government in 2014 started with a fiscal deficit of about 4.5% of GDP of that time. This was considered very high by the incumbent government. Arun Jaitley promised to consolidate the fiscal deficit, bring it down to 3%. The government was very much fastidious on bringing down the fiscal deficit. It passed a law to amend the FRBM Act in 2018, committed to bring the fiscal deficit down to 3% of GDP by 2021. In addition, the government also said that we will contain the debt and liabilities to 40% of GDP for the central government and 20% for the state governments. So that first term was sort of defined by complete commitment to fiscal consolidation. It did not go that way. The government found it difficult, had to start some off-budget borrowings in 2015-16. FCI areas were paid, food subsidy areas were paid by way of NSSF loans. Some of these fully serviced bonds and other off-budget liabilities were started. It went on. When the second term started, the COVID came, and that COVID provided a kind of opportunity to government to do two things. Number one, to clean up the off-budget borrowings. And in 21-22 budget, you found the government bringing everything on the budget, stop the NSSF system of funding the FCI. But as a consequence thereof, the government unleashed the fiscal deficit. In 21-22, the fiscal deficit went to as high as 9.5% of the GDP.
Yep.
And from then till now, government is running a very high fiscal deficit of about 6% or so. And that 10th year will end at about 6% of fiscal deficit when you had started at 4.5% or so. It's much higher than what it is. The government's new commitment now is to bring down from 4.5% by 25-26. The government would find it difficult. I would be watching with a lot of interest how the Modi guarantees are delivered in this budget. And my suspicion is that the government may not be able to move towards fiscal consolidation beyond 5.5 or 5.7% in the coming budget. And we will have the new tenure, the third term, if it were to come that way, with a very, very high fiscal debt.
Okay, that's a comprehensive overview. Mr. Gopalan, I come to you with the additional point that FY19 from 3.44% to 5.9% in the latest one, and clearly the circumstances of why the fiscal deficit is far higher than had originally been sort of contemplated by this government in its first term. What, according to you, are the reasons for the kind of fiscal performance, deficit performance that we are seeing also and showing to our viewers on this chart on the screen? Mr. Gopalan.
Well, Mr. Garg addressed this question very clearly. Well, COVID was one piece of event which really, made the government to work on loosening the purses, which many countries did, and we did rather more circumspectly, not throwing away everything to the winds. But we did some balancing, both with monetary policy easing as well as fiscal policy easing. We did both. That Mr. Garg should also know that he did a very good job. So I think that, there were circumstances which really, pushed the government to get into this kind of a fiscal deficit. But Mr. Garg would also understand that, from 14-15 onwards, the off-budget, borrowings, if they are taken into the fiscal deficit numbers, obviously they will show something in the range of about 4.5% to more than 4.5%, around about 5.5%, it would show at that point in time. So that is something which until about 2017-18, it would have been that much of a number, but the economy was slowing. Subsequent to about 17-18 onwards, the economy was also slowing, and therefore that kind of added to the fiscal deficit percentage as we went along. So I think they were caught in some circumstances which of their not own making. They tried to be as prudent as possible under the circumstances. And I think they did a decent job.
Okay, a decent job. Karan, I am coming to you, but before that, I just want to bring up another set of data on the screen, and I'll request my producer Sujit to do that. Two things. One, central government expenditure in the same 10-year period that we have data for. So, viewers, just take a look at this, appreciate the point. FY14 going up from, and you have that number right there on your screen, and you can see right up till the current year, it's going up almost 2.5 times. And if you see in percentage terms for capital expenditure, which is very significant, we'll come to the next plate, from 12.48%, capital expenditure has gone up, projected to end at 37.44%. So that's on the capital side. The total expenditure in terms of its year-on-year growth is obviously slowing, but the base has become much, much larger. There's one more bit of data, viewers, that I am throwing into the mix here for a quick look, and then we can come back to the data. And this is the expenditure of the central government on subsidies. Just one quick look at that once again. That point we had discussed just before Mr. Garg gave his answer. But on the subsidy front, you will see FY14, 2,54,632 crore, and by the time we are talking it's going up to 4 lakh. But most importantly FY22 and FY21, 22 and 23, those are the 3 key years to look for. 7,58,000 dropping to 5 lakh, and then next year 5,62,000. So a bulk of the heavy lifting happening in that period of FY21. Karan, I come to you because this is the backdrop. This is a government that has spent more, promised to spend more on capital. Subsidies have also gone up, and we have just reported today that even the Manrega allocation this year, there has been a third incremental increase, and by the time that this financial year ends, the increased spending on Manrega will be to the tune of almost 48% in the current financial year. So that was just the backdrop. So Karan, how would you describe the fiscal management of this government, particularly because former Finance Minister P Chidambaram had earlier said that the Modi government has done a good job on deficit management?
Right. I mean, if you look at situation as it emerged when the Modi government came in, first there was the Finance Commission report which had to be accepted. So suddenly, states got a lot more money. And then, of course, there was also the GST implementation where basically implicitly the central government kind of guaranteed 14% revenue growth. And what happens post GST is that inflation comes down. So your nominal growth rate goes down. And yet you are able to kind of, raise compensations as to kind of pay off states. So when you put all of that into perspective, when you put the fact that, there were a lot of off-budget balance sheets and that you had the twin deficit problem, and there was this very strong impulse that the government had to spend, and it refrained it in its first term. Of course, in its second term, it didn't have that choice because it had to kind of respond to the COVID economic shock. But even there, if you look at the expenditures that government committed, a lot of them were temporary in nature. And that's the important point, because that kind of differentiates what we did in the post-global financial crisis era, where, a lot of the commitments that we made in terms of expenditures were permanent, whereas this time around, a lot of them were temporary. And even if you look at some of the subsidy spending in the first year of Mr. Modi or even the second year of Mr. Modi, schemes such as Swachh Bharat, right? Like once you've constructed toilets, you don't need to give further subsidy. Same even with PM Awas. So what you would see is that a lot of the subsidy expenditures can now be diverted into other areas. And as the GDP itself grows, the share of subsidy bill as a proportion to GDP would kind of go down progressively over the next couple of years. And I think that's a very important factor, because back in 2013, when the Food Security Act was brought in, at that time there were concerns, for how long can we sustain and afford it. But the fiscal situation as of today, you don't have those kinds of discussions anymore, because it's become a very trivial amount overall. And I think the reality is that as Indian economy goes from, 2,500 per capita dollar, income to gradually $5,000, what you would find is that the state finances, particularly of the union government, are going to look much, much better, because there are more people that, you're progressively bringing into the tax net. Where there is a bit of, need to reassess is that when we're looking at India's fiscal deficit, we can't look at it in isolation during the pandemic period. It's also important to look at what has happened rest of the world, particularly, emerging markets with similar economies. And what you would find that even there, India has been the most prudent. So here you have a time where, the government could have actually spent a lot of money. They didn't have to bring everything onto their balance sheet and clean up the, fiscal accounts, etc. But it did those hard decisions largely because they wanted to be a bit more responsible as custodians of public money. And I think that's the key takeaway for me.
Mr. Garg, please comment on the fact that a lot of people say that Prime Minister Modi's government took a very hard call, politically sensitive call, unlike so many other nations in the immediate aftermath of COVID, to not sort of throw away money, but rather focus on longer term investment, capital expenditure, and many people were in fact even critical of that. Considering the fiscal situation across the world right now, do you think in retrospect Prime Minister Modi and his government have been proven right as far as their fiscal strategy is concerned?
So if you go back to May 20, when the COVID situation had hit us hard, Nirmala Sitharaman held a series of sort of conferences to announce the fiscal stimulus, right? And that was aggregated to about 25 lakh crores. That was not a small sum of money. What was different in the sense was its composition. There was a lot of liquidity from the Reserve Bank of India. There were a lot of liquidity sort of writing or postponing the loans from the discoms and others. There were built-in infrastructure, 1 lakh crore for agriculture infrastructure and so on. The hard sort of freebies or cash handouts for the people were smaller. That is where the difference is. That is what is emphasized now. Now, but at that time, the 25 lakh crore package was quite large in comparison or in line with what many other countries had done. Second, the difference is that while the Europeans and the Americans have a much larger per capita income, much larger budget, so to say, and still they wanted to afford a kind of safety wall to their own people. Whereas we decided now that the people who had suffered, you would remember 10 crore migrants walking and going out of their jobs getting lost, wages. There was a real pathetic situation. Now, anyone who says that the prudence lied in the strategy of not dispensing cash or the succor to these people at that time was a deliberate and was a sound strategy decided. In retrospect, I think is taking only an advantage that we did not take care of those people who were affected very badly at that time. And therefore, while from the inflationary point of view, it might sound in retrospect to be something sensible, though we also had very high episode of 2 years inflation in 21, 22 and 22, 23. So I am not I don't think I would sort of give full marks or appreciate this strategy of sort of trying to control inflation by sleight of hand.
Mr. Gopalan, do you agree with this view? And these are my words, that what Mr. Garg is saying, that perhaps the Modi government could have loosened its purse strings a bit more in the immediate aftermath of COVID to take care of the most vulnerable sections of society.
I would agree so. There could have been maybe about a trillion or 2 trillion piece they could have, offloaded more to get to the poor, with the people who were thrust into agriculture from urban areas. They moved into agriculture. The wages, the agricultural laborers numbers increased on account of COVID. Now, NREGA was not really, enough to get these people employment and therefore a livelihood. So some amount of, handouts should have been done to ensure that, these people had a much better living, because more people slid into poverty on account of this, COVID episode. So that's one problem we faced. Second, a large number of, household enterprises vanished or died, as our study shows. Of course, that was compounded by COVID and by previous incidents like, GST and DMON and those kind of things. So those kind of people who had their capital totally wiped out, to have a living, they did not have enough capital, substitution from the economy. Now, since that did not kind of happen, the way they could generate income and then move out of poverty on their own volition did not occur. So as a result, if some amount of handout had been given or capital substitution would have been given to these household enterprises, probably things would have moved better. The kind of poverty which we saw subsequently would not have arisen as a result. But once again, they are subject to number of other constraints which Mr. Garg knows and we all know about.
Karan, how significant are those constraints? You have also worked on some of them, and you also have international exposure sitting in Washington DC. The whole world was far more liberal with its purse strings, and India was an outlier in that regard. Would it have really mattered to those who watch India's fiscal discipline very closely, global investors, if we had gone half a percentage point or thereabouts more, and perhaps helped some of those extremely vulnerable sections of society?
So let me begin by, making 2 or 3 quick points. I mean, because this is an issue where I worked extensively, much during the period of the pandemic. There's no evidence available that pandemic actually worsened extreme poverty in India. This is not just my paper with Dr. Bhalla and Dr. Virmani, but also Arvind Panagaria's recent paper that looked at PLFS data, and they concluded that the additional support given by the government in the form of free food, it went up to about 30% of the poverty line, 36% of the poverty line for the person who was just at the margin. For people below it, of course, made a big difference. And that's an important point that unfortunately, people have forgotten. Of course, if you take a higher poverty line, it does make a difference. But then again, what we are talking about is the most vulnerable section. And for some reason, the support that was given was just enough to insure them against this shock. So that's point number one. And second thing, when we talk about India's inflation, again, we are looking at it in isolation because India's inflation went up to 8%. But remember, India's inflation target is, 2 to 6. So it just went up to 8%, whereas, in the US, it went from a normal average of 2% to about 8%. So look at, where the mean is and how far it has gone up. And so in that sense, inflation didn't really went up in India in a relative sense. And the reason I'm bringing this is because this is an important point, that if there would have been more inflation at that point, because, markets were shut. So even if you give people money, they can't actually go and buy till the time there's a lockdown. Whatever can be bought will be bought only once markets are open. That would have led to a problem of inflation, which would have actually affected the poor more, rather than not giving them additional money and not trying to pump prime during that period. So in that sense, I think we got the timing of the support right, and we got the composition right, because a lot of the fiscal support that happened was post lockdown. But the broader point, could we have done more? It's always difficult to answer that question, but I'm a big believer that because a lot of our debt is in Indian rupees, right? A lot of the discussion on fiscal and what is the level of debt, etc. I think it's irrelevant. The real constraint is inflation that we need to look at. But given that the government wants to borrow abroad, because they want those bond inclusions, because they want more money coming into India's debt markets, I think that's where fiscal deficit numbers, debt numbers, and responsible policy making matters a lot.
Okay.
Because you already see, when foreign investors enter the bond market, they're not gonna follow whatever yield curve management RBI dictates.
And if you look at what's happening as far as portfolio investors are concerned, and what is happening with our stock market, I think inflows into the Indian stock market have for a good part of the past 2.5 years completely overlooked certain macro factors. Fund flows have been driven by reasons. Mr. Garg, I wonder if you want to make a few observations on what Karan just said, especially about the point of where would people spend even if there had been some sort of cash handout. And I also want to ask your view whether such a strategy would have led to inflation, because the post-COVID inflation was a supply side shock inflation. Would that have worsened the situation in India?
See, we are not talking about discretionary spending on hotels or travel or something. We are talking about the basic consumption needs. whether you are in COVID situation or you're not, you need to eat. You need to have medical attention. You have to get some of these things there. And if we on one side say that by doubling the the food allowance from 5 kg to 10 kg per unit, we were taking care of the needs. Similarly, you need to take the other basic needs requirement, etc. The lockdown was there, but despite lockdown, you had to deliver the food, you have to deliver transportation for people to get from their places to. I don't think this COVID situation prevented anyone from getting these. In fact, those kind of restrictions were absolutely unnecessary. They perhaps harmed the cause of COVID protection much more than otherwise.
Absolutely.
So I don't buy this theory that even if the assistance was delivered, this would not have been spent. We're not talking about discretionary spending. And on your I think your other point was about the foreign flow.
A comment about inflation impact, but since
See, inflation in India is a very different creature than anywhere else.
right,
Our retail or consumer index is largely made up of the food items.
Yeah.
Food and vegetables and all, 50% is more or less of that. And the remaining is some of the services like rent, bank account, and those charges. So the inflation moves, retail inflation moves irrespective of what you do in the monetary policies. I have said this and I am repeating this again. The monetary policy has virtually no impact on the retail inflation of India. The monetary policy is basically designed to take care of the wholesale inflation, which has moved very differently. For 2 years, the wholesale inflation was in double digits. At that time when we were having large liquidity inflows and the monetary policy was not tight, it was very loose. And when the monetary policy was tightened, the wholesale inflation has actually come down to virtually negative. So I don't think the fiscal side or the regulatory, how do you regulate the export of wheat, rice, do you
right.
That is what makes more difference rather than the monetary policy on the retail inflation in it.
Okay. Mr. Gopalan wanted to come in. Karan, Mr. Gopalan, go ahead and then I go to Karan. Yeah.
Quick comment. India's inflation, if you look at it, it is more supply side phenomenon rather than anything else. Now, on a supply side, this thing, if commodities don't have enough, supply, obviously prices go up. Monetary policy in some sense is helpful to weather the inflationary expectations, but the supply side is the one which really decides on the inflation, and that is attended to by fiscal side rather than by the monetary side. That is India's domestic this thing. But let me come to Karan's question of people were not in a position to people did not have employment, people did not have sources of income, and supply side was also affected, therefore inflation was there. But then if you have to ensure that people are able to buy, people are able to get a decent living, obviously some amount of money should be in their hands. That was dried up very considerably during that time. And to say that, people of, poverty, number of people below poverty have gone down or not, I also would like Karan to look into other literature which clearly states that there were the increase in poverty levels as a result of COVID. That I would like him to read also, not quote one or two he has access to.
Karan, respond to that before I go to the last part of our discussion.
The IMF working paper that I wrote basically discusses each of those studies in extensive detail. So you might as well want to take a look at that. And none of those studies actually make their data public. We have transparently made all our data public for anyone to see, state level poverty rates, poverty lines. So I would actually urge you to go and see and, even look at the PLFS data if you want.
Incidentally, I had looked at those data. I am making points based on studies which have been conducted at various
Basically,
levels. So anyway,
basically, but basically,
if it is a debatable point, let us, leave it, or we can debate later.
yeah. So, but the more important point, that you're making, that you could have spent and that wouldn't have led to inflation, but that's precisely the point. If it's supply-driven inflation, and if you give people money, incidentally, India did do some cash transfers, but they were very measured. And I'm saying this from international experience that I've observed, particularly even in the US. What I observed, what was happening at that time, is that there was a lot of spending beyond your basic necessities. And when you're talking about India's inflation, keep in mind that our CPI indicator is just 10-year-old in terms of the weight, so you don't really know what actual inflation people are facing at the moment.
So,
and that's a bigger
Karan,
problem. So
Karan, I'm intervening here because the larger debate about whether the US did well is also there to do, because we sometimes look a lot inwards, but the United States economy, its fiscal decisions, its monetary policy has an impact globally, and perhaps at some point we should debate that. But as we wind down the show, I want to go across my entire panel to ask about what next. Mr. Garg, I come to you. The markets and everybody is awaiting the outcome of the next general election. A third term and the return of Modinomics in the third term. From a fiscal point of view, this government has reset the button on several important economic issues. On the fiscal side, what would you suggest should be done once a new government comes in place? What kind of reset do we need, including of the FRBM and certain targets that bind our monetary policy framework as well?
See, I am very clear in my assessment and my opinion that large fiscal deficits are bad for our country. And 6% is a very large fiscal deficit. Saying we'll bring it to 4.5% is also very large. So I don't think this is good for our health. We are going to have interim budget a couple of days later. There is whole issue of Modi guarantees. If you look at 2019 budget, at that time there were also three major announcements which were populist nature. The income tax limit was effectively raised to 5 lakhs, bringing 2.5 crore taxpayers out of the tax net. The PM Kisan scheme was announced there very clearly for the 12 crores farmers. And that unorganized worker scheme, PM Mandhan or Shramyogi Mandhan. So I would love to see that this budget brings some sort of fiscal consolidation, and the July budget attempts a very serious fiscal consolidation, but I don't think it's likely to be there at this time. I'm keeping my fingers.
Gopalan, that same question to you. What would you like to hear in the interim budget and the full budget?
Well, there will be, I have a hunch that this will be, since it's an election season, obviously there will be a lot of noise about helping farmers, poor people, female workers and females, and youth because of the unemployment issues. So there will be a lot of, some amount of indication of what the next government, if Modi Sarkar comes back, what is the way in which they are going to take the economy forward is going to be a major factor in the interim budget. But as far as the regular budget is concerned, if the same government comes back to power, then there will be a lot of fiscal deficit is very important thing, and 4.5 is something which they have to achieve. That's fine. But more importantly, how are they going to ensure that apart from the budget, the labor market, the land market, how are they going to deregulate them in a big way? How are they going to ensure that agriculture is going to become more prosperous, thanks to removing restrictions across all the ways in which we have got restrictions? These are some of the important things which one would like to look at. Whether they can be in, I don't think it will be in the interim budget, but in the regular budget, these things will have to be addressed, and I hope they will be addressed.
Okay, Karan, you have the final word on the show. what can we expect on the 1st of February? I feel that it will perhaps sketch out a vision for the next 5 years, or at least the preamble of a vision that will be delivered in July. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think they're going to use this opportunity much like they did in 2019 to basically, kind of stress upon what they're likely to do in the next term. And we do see some of that already in terms of the announcements that PM has made, with regards to 1 crore households getting free solar infrastructure. So some of that will be there. But, unlike the other two panelists, I'm not too much of a fiscal hawk. I think that you can get to 4.5% in 3 years rather than 2.
But is there an element of worry? Is there an element of worry around Modi guarantees, or is that Modi guarantees just a word of all that has been done so far, Karan?
No, so there are new elements there, and I think the only way you can actually provision for it in the budget is if you get to 4.5% in 3 years rather than 2. Because as you have noted, tax revenues are looking buoyant, and the economy itself is doing well. So it is, as I started with this point, that the state of government finances are going to look much better 2 years forward than today. And I think that's the important, takeaway for me at the moment with regards to fiscal consolidation. So it would be easier to do consolidation of 0.5% every year and still leave a lot of space to maintain the kind of expenditures you need to keep up with your commitments. So I think that would be an important call that the finance minister would have to take on the first. And remember, this is an interim budget, so it could very well be that in on first they might have one particular fiscal roadmap, and then in July, they might like to tinker with it a bit once the election is done. But I don't think they would do that, because they're kind of very clear with what they want to achieve in the next 5 years. And it would be nice that if they basically lay the plan transparently, because it's in all likelihood they're going to return.
Viewers, we have had two of our foremost policy makers who have spent their time on the show today, and young economist Karan Bhasin providing us an alternate view. But it's a fact, 10 years of the Modi government, all manner of challenges that are possible, including a once in a lifetime event like COVID, and also some very brave decisions of great political as well as economic consequence, including GST or demonetization, and several other steps that have been taken. The cumulative impact of that is very clearly visible as far as the investor mood within India and overseas is concerned. I spent a week in Davos speaking to all manner cross section of people in business, in finance, and their view about India has never been as positive. And clearly, therefore, the interim budget will just be the first opening of the full budget in July, which many believe will be delivered by Prime Minister Modi's government and the finance minister who is chosen in May. The markets will continue to look towards a clear-cut fiscal roadmap, and perhaps there is an opportunity for the government now to provide a roadmap that is credible and is for 5 years rather than for a shorter term of time. Mr. Garg, Mr. Gopalan and Karan, thank you very much for your time with us today. With that, it's a wrap on the show. Viewers, we'll be back with more. Until then, goodbye.
Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe from multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines and sectors.